Why is almost every window on a ship round, when round windows are harder and far costlier to build?
A square window is easier to cut, easier to frame, and far easier to fit with simple, flat glass. And yet, shipbuilders chose that harder, costlier shape deliberately for well over 150 years. The reason is hidden underwater, where the pressure presses on a hull with a relentless, crushing, invisible force. Get the shape wrong, and that quiet force finds the single weakest corner and tears the ship apart. Look closely the next time you stand on a ferry, a harbor cruiser, or an old wooden boat tied up at the dock. The windows down near the water are almost never square, and once you finally notice it, you genuinely cannot unsee the pattern again. They are circles, ringed in heavy brass or steel, bolted down tight like something that fully expects one day to be tested. We call them portholes, and most of us treat them as charming little details, the romantic postcards of a life lived at sea. But a porthole is not a decoration, and it was never chosen because it happened to look quaint or old-fashioned or pleasantly nautical. It is a solution, shaped slowly and painfully by failure, to a problem that lives just below the waterline and never sleeps. Think for a moment about what a window really asks of a wall, whether that wall stands on dry land or out at sea. You cut a hole in something strong, then you cover that hole with something far weaker, and you quietly hope the difference never truly matters. On land, it rarely does matter because air is gentle and gravity pulls straight down, and the glass in your house is mostly left in peace. But the sea is not gentle, and it does not pull straight down. It pushes inward, hard, from every direction at the same instant. For every meter you sink below the surface, the water stacks more weight onto the hull, squeezing the whole vessel like a slow closing fist. Only a few meters down, that squeeze is already strong enough to matter a great deal, and it never once eases off or lets go. So the window sitting at the waterline is holding back a force that the window above your kitchen sink will never feel in its life. That is exactly why the two of them, which look like simple cousins at a glance, are in truth almost nothing alike at all. One of them merely frames a quiet garden and lets in the morning light for someone drinking their coffee in peace. The other is a plug driven into the side of a dam, except the dam in this case happens to be the entire ocean. To really understand the shape, you have to stop asking how a window looks and start asking instead how a window actually breaks. Because out there, a window is not really a view at all. It is a hole cut deliberately into the one thin barrier keeping the sea out. And the ocean spends every single second of every single day patiently looking for a way back in through that one tempting hole. A square window seems completely harmless on land, where the worst thing ever pressing against it is a soft afternoon breeze or a little rain. But carry that exact same shape down underwater, and its four neat corners quietly become four open invitations to a slow disaster. This whole video is about one shape, and the long, expensive, deadly lesson that finally taught us as a species to trust it. We will follow that single lesson from wooden warships to doomed jet airliners, all the way down to submarines crushed in the dark. By the end, you will start to spot this one humble curve hiding in plain sight in places you walk straight past every day. So the real question was never really why portholes are round. It is why anyone ever believed, even for a moment, that a square one would hold. To truly see why the corner is so dangerous, forget about ships for a moment and just pick up an ordinary sheet of paper. Pull it hard from both ends and it stubbornly resists you, because flat paper is surprisingly strong when the pull is shared evenly across the whole edge. Now make one tiny nick, a single small notch, right at the edge of that very same sheet of paper. Pull on it again with no more force than before, and it tears effortlessly, ripping straight across from that one little cut. Nothing whatsoever about the paper changed except its shape, and yet its strength against your hands has almost completely collapsed. That tiny notch is the entire secret of the porthole, written so small that you can hold the whole idea right there in your hands. When you put stress on any solid object, the force locked inside it has to flow somewhere, much like water moving through the material itself. Across a smooth, gentle, sweeping curve, that flow of force spreads itself out and slides past without ever piling up dangerously in one spot. But force cannot turn a sharp corner smoothly, any more than a fast-moving river can take a perfect right-angle bend without churning. So, at the corner, it bunches up, crowds together, and concentrates itself into the tiny, unlucky point where the two edges meet. Engineers gave this crowding a name long ago. They call it stress concentration, and it is the patient, quiet killer at the heart of our story. Right at a sharp corner, the local stress can climb to several times higher than the gentle, average force you actually applied from outside. This same effect is why you tear open a stubborn packet of crisps by starting from that little pre-cut notch built into the seam. It is why a glass cutter does not smash the pane, but only scratches one thin line, then lets the glass snap cleanly along it. It is why a small chip in a car windscreen so often creeps, over weeks, into a long crack that wanders right across the whole pane. The flaw quietly gathers the force, focuses it down to a point, and then uses it like the sharp tip of an invisible chisel. A perfect curve, by contrast, gives the force no such point to gather around, so the load stays politely and safely spread out everywhere. Builders have known a softer version of this truth for thousands of years, which is exactly why a stone arch can carry a cathedral. An arch and the gentle dome above it work because they guide the crushing weight smoothly around a curve and down into the ground. An eggshell, thin as paper, survives a surprising squeeze from your whole hand for the very same reason a dome does. The curve shares the burden, while a flat panel with hard corners hoards all of that burden in just a few weak spots. So now bring the cold ocean back into the picture, and imagine a single square window set into the side of a steel hull. The flat glass and the flat metal sides feel the pressure too, but they manage to share it fairly evenly across their broad faces. The four corners, though, do not share anything. Each one quietly becomes a little trap where the squeezing force piles up and grows sharp. Day after day, wave after wave, the hull of a working ship flexes and breathes, and every single flex drives that pressure into the corners again. Metal does not have to shatter all at once in order to fail completely, and this is the part that most people find genuinely hard to believe. It can be weakened just a little with each and every cycle, building an invisible fatigue deep inside, until, one perfectly ordinary day, it finally gives way. A round window simply erases this entire problem by erasing the corners that were quietly causing it in the very first place. There is no longer any point for the force to crowd into, so the stress glides smoothly around the ring and stays low all the way around. The load that would have slowly torn a square frame to pieces is instead shared, gently and equally, by the whole unbroken circle. Round is not prettier, and it is honestly not cheaper to build, but it is the one shape that never hands the sea a knife. Hold tightly onto that single idea, because every story that follows from here is really just the same hard lesson, learned painfully all over again. For most of human history, the lower decks of a ship were dark, damp, gloomy places, with no real windows down there at all. A hole cut below the waterline was once simply unthinkable to a shipwright, because a hole down there is just a slow, polite way to drown. The only openings ever cut low in a wooden warship were the gun ports, square hatches built for the cannon, never for the daylight. Those gun ports had heavy hinged wooden lids, and the crews sealed them shut tightly whenever the weather or the enemy or the sea turned dangerous. When the great warship Mary Rose heeled hard over with her lower gun port still open, the sea simply poured straight in and dragged her down. Hundreds of men were lost in minutes, and the lesson was carved deep into naval memory that a low square opening is a terrible gamble. So the earliest square openings near the waterline carried a genuinely grim reputation, long before anyone seriously thought about fitting them with glass. The window as we know it only arrived much later, when iron and then strong steel finally let builders make hulls that were both stronger and tighter. Sailors still desperately needed daylight and fresh air below decks, and now at last, engineers had a metal that could frame an opening safely. They took a thick circle of heavy glass and set it into a sturdy ring of brass or bronze that could shrug off the relentless salt. Brass and bronze were chosen deliberately because they resist corrosion, where ordinary iron would quickly rust, weep red stains, and eventually fail right at the critical seal. This round glazed opening was given its own proper name at sea, the side scuttle, although nearly all of us simply call it a porthole today. And from the very beginning, the good ones were always built round, because the shipwrights had already paid, in lives, to learn exactly what corners do. A real porthole, though, is far more than just a circle of glass, because the sea stubbornly demands a backup for absolutely everything. Behind or beside the glass sits a hinged, solid metal cover called a deadlight, kept ready to swing across and seal the opening in a storm. When truly heavy weather hits, the crew closes that thick lid, sealing the porthole completely, even if the glass behind it were somehow to shatter. The whole heavy assembly is then clamped down hard with screw fittings, often called dogs, which pull the seal tight and even against its frame. Every single part of it is round because every single part of it has to hold back pressure, and pressure, as we have seen, always punishes the corner. Even the bolts themselves are spaced evenly all the way around the ring, sharing the clamping force exactly the same way the circle shares the load. You can actually read the quiet priorities of any ship just by studying the shape and the size of all its various openings. Down low, close to the water, the portholes are always small, thick, and perfectly round, simply because down there the crushing sea is at its very strongest. Higher up, on the upper decks far above the waterline, the windows are allowed to grow larger, and sometimes, surprisingly, even square again. That is not a contradiction at all. It is the very same rule, simply applied honestly and exactly to wherever the real pressure happens to be. A large square window high up on a superstructure may never once feel real water pressure, so its dangerous corners can be safely forgiven. But drop that very same square window down to the waterline, and the patient ocean would find and exploit its corners within a single hard season. So the round porthole was never really a sudden invention, but instead a slow agreement, signed quietly over centuries in lost ships and silent funerals. Generation after generation of builders tried different shapes, watched too many of them fail, and slowly converged on the one circle that simply refused to crack. By the great golden age of the ocean liners, the round porthole was simply how any serious ocean-crossing ship honestly met the open sea. It had become so completely normal, so utterly expected, that people slowly forgot it was ever an answer and began seeing it as mere decoration. The polished brass ring around the thick glass looked romantic and nostalgic, and the hard, bloody reason behind the curve faded quietly into the background. And then, several decades later, a brand new and dazzling machine would forget that hard-won reason completely and be forced to relearn it high in the sky. In the early 1950s, Britain genuinely stunned the entire world with the de Havilland Comet, the very first true jet airliner ever to fly. It was sleek, astonishingly fast, and beautiful, and it flew higher and far more smoothly than anything ordinary passengers had ever experienced before. But to cruise that high, the cabin had to be pressurized, pumped up firmly like a balloon, so that the people inside could simply breathe in comfort. And that one single fact quietly turned the whole graceful fuselage into something it had genuinely never truly been designed to be before: a pressure vessel. Up at cruising altitude, the dense air inside pushed firmly outward against the thin metal skin, while the thin air outside pushed only feebly back. With every single flight, the entire body of the aircraft inflated just a little, swelling outward, and then slowly deflated again on the long way back down. The Comet's passenger windows and some of the cutouts in its skin had been built with corners that were nearly fatally square. On the ground, on the calm drawing board, those square corners looked perfectly reasonable, and the strong aircraft aluminium seemed far more than strong enough for the job. But the engineers had built, without ever quite realizing the danger, exactly the same deadly trap that the sea had been warning sailors about for centuries. Each and every flight stressed those sharp corners, then released them, then stress them all over again, cycle after relentless cycle. The metal was slowly, silently fatiguing right at the corners, building tiny invisible cracks that were far too small for any inspector's eye to ever catch. Nothing ever looked wrong. The aircraft flew beautifully and proudly, and yet the hidden danger grew silently with every single takeoff and every gentle landing. Then, in 1954, two of the comets broke apart in midair, falling from the sky within just a few short months of each other. There was no warning at all, and no obvious cause, and the world's single most advanced airliner had suddenly become a terrifying, deadly mystery. In response, every comet in the world was grounded. The entire proud fleet pulled from the sky, while engineers raced to understand what was killing them. The investigation that followed quickly became one of the most famous and brilliant detective stories in the entire history of engineering. Crews painstakingly recovered shattered wreckage from the bottom of the sea, while a team took a whole intact comet fuselage and sealed it inside a giant water tank. They then pumped the pressure up and down, again and again, patiently simulating flight after flight, to force the hidden, deadly failure out into the open. And after many thousands of these simulated flights, the metal finally tore, starting, exactly as they had feared, right at the corner of an opening. The crack had quietly begun precisely where the stress concentrated, at a corner, and from there it raced outward until the whole pressurized body split apart. It was the humble paper notch all over again, only this time it was aircraft aluminium, and now the stakes were being measured in human lives. The patient sea had taught this exact lesson slowly over long, salty centuries, and the sky had just been forced to learn the very same thing in a few brutal years. The eventual fix was precisely the same answer that the old sailors had quietly reached long before. Take away the corners and let the curve carry the load. The later comets, and very nearly every airliner that has followed since, were carefully redesigned with smoothly rounded oval windows that spread the stress evenly. So look at any passenger jet window today on your next flight, and you will see soft, gently rounded corners, and never once a sharp right angle. That gentle little oval right beside your seat is not a styling choice, and it honestly never was about looking modern, sleek, or friendly. It is a direct descendant of the ship's porthole, quietly carrying the very same ancient defense against the very same patient, invisible enemy. The pressure trying to burst a jet open at altitude is really just the close cousin of the pressure trying to crush a submarine's hull at depth. Both of them are completely invisible. Both are utterly relentless. And both of them hunt patiently for a single corner where they can finally begin their work. The comet's tragedy is exactly why we can honestly say the round window is a hard lesson that two completely different worlds we're both forced to learn. And the deeper down you go, into the coldest and darkest water anywhere on Earth, the more absolute and unforgiving that one lesson quietly becomes. If the pressure pushing at the waterline is like a closing fist, then the pressure waiting in the deep ocean is something far closer to a hydraulic vice. For roughly every 10 meters that you descend beneath the waves, the squeeze on the hull increases again by about one whole atmosphere of pressure. Go down just a few hundred meters in a submarine, and the sea is already pressing in on every surface with a crushing, patient, completely unforgiving weight. At those real depths, a single careless corner is no longer a slow danger spread over seasons. It is a sudden, immediate, and total catastrophe. So a submarine is designed from the very keel upward, almost entirely around the one overriding job of resisting that enormous inward squeeze. And almost every important shape anywhere on it is a circle, a cylinder, or a sphere. Quite simply because nothing else down there reliably survives. The main body of the submarine, the pressure hull that actually holds the living crew, is essentially just one long, carefully built steel tube. A cylinder handles even, all-around pressure far better than any boxy shape ever could, because it offers no flat faces for the sea to cave inward. The ends of that tube are not flat plates, but smooth domes, curved caps that carry the load gracefully around themselves instead of simply bowing inward and failing. The hatches are round, the openings are round, and the precious few viewing ports are kept small, thick, and very deliberately perfectly circular. Every single place where a designer might have been tempted to cut a convenient square, the engineers instead cut a careful, disciplined circle. Down there, the sea does not forgive bad aesthetics, and it most certainly does not ever forgive the quiet vanity of a sharp corner. Go deeper still, into the strange realm of the research submersibles, and the shape grows even purer, even simpler, and even more extreme. The rare vessels that visit the very deepest trenches on Earth carry their crews sealed inside a near-perfect sphere of thick, immensely strong metal. A sphere is, quite simply, the strongest possible shape against pressure, because it shares any inward squeeze perfectly equally across its entire continuous surface. There is no weak side to it, no long, unsupported span, and no lonely corner, just one single continuous curve, holding back literally miles of water above. Even the small windows on these deep machines are special, often thick cones of solid acrylic, mounted with the narrow end facing out into the sea. As the outside pressure rises with depth, it pushes that cone ever harder into its seat. So the deep ocean itself actually helps to seal the window shut. It is a strange and genuinely beautiful idea that the very same force which is trying to destroy you can be quietly turned into the thing protecting you. But that lovely trick only ever works if you respect the geometry completely, and you never, not even once, give the pressure a corner to exploit. In 1960, a tiny craft called the Trieste carried two men down to the deepest point in all the world's oceans and back up alive. It survived that almost unimaginable pressure for one simple reason: that its crew sat inside a thick steel sphere, the only shape that could hold. And even in modern times, when ambitious designers have strayed away from these proven curved spherical shapes for the deepest dives, the ocean has enforced its ancient rule without any mercy at all. A flat window in a deep submersible would be an instant death sentence, and a perfectly square one would be nothing more than pure fatal fantasy. The deeper the dive, the rounder absolutely everything has to become, until the entire design is, in the end, almost nothing but smooth curves and spheres. The crushing pressure of the deep simply strips away every shape that dares to disobey the rule, and what is left is the same humble circle we began with. Once you truly understand this one rule, you suddenly start to see this single shape quietly governing the whole built world all around you. The window right beside your airplane seat, with its soft, rounded corners, is really just the sky's own faithful version of the ship's porthole. The little round windows along a cruise ship's lower decks are the direct, unbroken heirs of those first thick brass scuttles from long ago. Even spacecraft, holding a tiny, fragile cabin of breathable air against the hard, infinite vacuum of space, lean naturally toward rounded, circular ports. Anywhere at all where a thin wall has to hold back a great difference in pressure, the dangerous corners quietly disappear and the safe curves take over. It is one of those rare patterns that the very moment you finally see it seems to have been hiding in plain sight for your whole life. And the very same rule even neatly explains the apparent exceptions. The genuinely square windows that you really do sometimes see on the big ships. Look carefully, and you will find that those square windows always live high up on the upper decks, far above the dangerous reach of the waterline. Up there, no real water pressure ever presses hard against the glass, so the otherwise dangerous corner now costs nothing and is allowed to stay. They are windows in the ordinary, everyday sense, just a view and a little light, and not desperate plugs holding back the crushing weight of the sea. The very moment a window actually has to fight against true pressure, the corner vanishes again. Every single time, completely without exception. You do not even have to go to sea to find this rule quietly at work, because you almost certainly own a small pressure vessel already. The round glass door on the front of a washing machine is round for the very same reason a porthole is, to safely hold water and pressure inside. The heavy lid of a pressure cooker and the curved walls of a simple diving cylinder all quietly obey the exact same unbreakable law of the corner. What I genuinely love about the humble porthole is just how honestly it admits, right there in its shape, exactly what it is afraid of. It does not pretend the sea is gentle, or quietly hope that good intentions and strong, thick glass will somehow be enough on their own. It takes the simple, hard, brutal truth about corners and force, and then it builds that very truth directly and permanently into its own shape. Centuries of working sailors and a whole generation of heartbroken aviation engineers, every one of them eventually arrived at the very same quiet circle. The torn paper notch, the creeping, cracked windscreen, the shattered jet fuselage, and the crushed deep-sea hull are, in the end, all really the very same story. And the round window is simply the one answer that every single one of those painful stories was, in its own hard way, quietly asking for. So the very next time that you happen to pass a porthole, you will know that it is far, far more than just a charming little maritime detail. You are actually looking at a scar turned carefully into a design, a memory of real failure, patiently shaped into something that finally, reliably holds. That single curve is the sea's own signature, pressed permanently and deliberately into the steel, the brass, the glass, and even the aircraft aluminum. It is quiet proof that we did, eventually, finally, listen to a hard lesson that the patient ocean was always more than willing to teach us. A square window quietly asks the pressure to come and find its single weakest point, and the pressure, given just a little time, always will. A round window simply leaves that pressure nowhere at all to begin, and that one quiet, stubborn refusal is exactly why the window at sea is round.